Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome back to the deep dive.
Good to be back.
Today, we're really plunging into a situation that, well, it feels like it's shifting moment by moment.
Absolutely.
The escalating tension and, the recent military actions between Israel and Iran.
Yeah.
Our focus is going to be specifically on Israel's latest offensive operations and maybe crucially, this really significant question that's popped up about potential direct U.S. military involvement.
And what makes this deep dive, I think, particularly interesting is the way we can pull together insights from the source material you've gathered.
Right.
We're looking mainly at analysis from a YouTube transcript, but that source itself is kind of synthesizing reports from places like the Wall Street Journal, Axios.
Established outlets.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's combining that with analysis of recent satellite imagery. So it gives you this kind of composite view, doesn't it, from several angles?
Absolutely. So our mission here in this deep dive is really to sift through all this information. We want to understand the recent developments, like what's actually happened on the ground, in the air.
Yeah, the facts first.
We need to try and figure out the strategic thinking, behind the key actions in these requests being made.
Mm-hmm.
We'll assess what the reported impact of the strikes has actually been so far, based on what we can tell.
Right, the BDA, the battle damage assessment.
And then really explore the potential implications of all this, especially keeping an eye on the evolving U.S. position. It's a complex picture, for sure.
It is.
But there are some incredibly critical pieces of knowledge to pull out that hopefully help make sense of it.
That's right. And the goal, I think, is to move beyond just the sort of headline reactions.
Yeah.
By understanding the details, the nuance, and the underlying strategic logic, you, the listener, can get a much clearer picture of the dynamics driving this and, well, maybe what might happen next.
Precisely. So let's jump straight into what feels like maybe the biggest new element emerging from the sources right now, the U.S. dimension.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to have gone beyond just, keeping an eye on things. There's a very direct appeal reportedly being made.
There is, yeah. And this is, I think, one of the most striking points that the source material highlights. It details this core request coming directly from Israel to the United States.
Wow.
Israel has explicitly asked the U.S. to join what they're framing as a necessary war specifically. The goal is to help eliminate Iran's nuclear program.
Eliminate it, not just contain it.
Eliminate it. And this isn't presented as just some informal suggestion, It's framed as a formal, really high-stakes request that's been reported through these channels.
That's a massive ask. And the source gives a pretty specific, almost technical reason why Israel feels it needs the U.S. for this particular job.
Yeah.
It really boils down to capabilities, doesn't it?
It does, entirely.
Yeah.
The source highlights this critical gap in Israel's reported military capabilities when it comes to certain types of targets.
Okay.
Targets that are central to Iran's nuclear program. Think about facilities built deep, deep underground, designed specifically to withstand conventional attacks.
Like the Fordo facility,
Yeah.
the one built into the mountain.
Exactly. Fordo, that's the prime example given in the source. It's deeply buried,
Yeah.
protected by tons of rock and earth.
Right.
So to effectively destroy a site like that, you need very specific things, munitions, and the aircraft capable of delivering them accurately with enough force.
And the source names them.
It does,
Right.
explicitly. Bunker buster bombs and large bomber aircraft.
Oh.
And the report is that Israel, they reportedly don't possess these particular assets, or at least not in the necessary quantities or the right delivery platforms to tackle those kinds of targets effectively on their own.
And the flip side, the crucial detail, according to the source, is that the United States does have these assets.
Yeah.
And not just somewhere far off.
Right. That's key. The source points out the U.S. has these capabilities, the heavy bombers, the bunker busters within flying distance of Iran. This is presented as the real enabler here. Israel, based on these reports, can't reach and destroy these deep, hardened sites alone. The U.S. can. Therefore, from Israel's perspective, as it's laid out in the source, eliminating those deep underground parts of the nuclear program, it requires direct U.S. military involvement.
Which ties right back to Israel's fundamental strategic goal, as the source outlines it, neutralizing what they see as an existential threat.
It absolutely does. The argument, as it's articulated in the source, is that for this whole operation, Operation Rising Lion, to be considered truly successful, it can't just degrade Iran's military stuff above ground. If the core of the nuclear program, especially those hardened, inaccessible sites, if that remains intact, then the existential threat, as they define it, hasn't really been removed.
The job's not done.
The job's not finished, exactly, from their perspective. And that's why this request for U.S. help with these specific targets becomes so central to their overall strategic objective in this conflict. It kind of elevates the whole U.S. involvement question from just assistance to, well, fundamental necessity for achieving their stated goal of dismantling that nuclear capability.
Okay, so that's the request for offensive involvement, hitting those deep nuclear sites Israel says it can't reach. But it's really important to understand, as the source clarifies, that the U.S. is already involved to some degree, just primarily in a defensive way right now.
Yes, that distinction is absolutely vital. While you've had, denials from U.S. officials about participating in offensive strikes with Israel,
Right.
the source, and it's drawing on reports like those in the Wall Street Journal, confirms a significant level of defensive U.S. involvement.
So what does that defensive role actually look like, based on what the sources are describing?
Well, it involves positioning quite substantial U.S. military assets across the region. We're talking about things like U.S. jet fighters, Navy destroyers, which have missile defense systems, ground-based air defense batteries in various spots, maybe even ground-based interceptors.
And what are they doing?
The core function of these assets during the recent Iranian attacks has been to actively track and then intercept Iranian missiles and drones that were fired at Israel.
So actively shooting them down.
Actively shooting them down. They weren't launching strikes into Iran, but they were directly engaging these inbound threats aimed at an ally.
So it's definitely not just observing. It's, as the source puts it, more involvement than nothing.
Exactly. It's active participation in the defense. And the source makes a point of referencing official statements, too. Figures like President Trump, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, which is interesting phrasing in the source for that name.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Who have consistently stated the U.S. was not involved in offensive operations with Israel. But, intercepting missiles and drones, that's not a neutral act. It is direct intervention in the conflict, even if it's on the defensive side.
And a defensive role, it isn't without risk either, is it?
Absolutely not. The source really underscores this point. Just having U.S. aircraft flying in contested airspace, where there are incoming drones, incoming missiles, other fighter jets operating, it's inherently dangerous. It's described as not the safest place to be.
Yeah.
U.S. military personnel, whether they're on ships, at bases with air defenses, or flying these combat air patrols, they're in harm's way, directly exposed to potential threats, even if their whole mission is just defensive interception. It's not some theoretical risk. It's tangible right now for personnel in the region.
Okay, so you've got Israel making this huge request for offensive help on specific targets.
Yep.
You've got the U.S. already involved defensively, facing risks. And this brings us to the intense political debate that's reportedly happening inside the U.S. government. The source mentions these unverified reports, discussions in the White House.
It does. And it's careful to note, this is unverified, anonymous source type stuff. That's important context.
Right.
However, it gives these reports some weight. Precisely because, well, as we just discussed, the U.S. is already engaged defensively, already putting personnel at risk, and also because President Trump's own public statements haven't shut the door on offensive involvement.
Right.
So the fact that it's even being discussed, even if the reports are unofficial, it gains a certain credibility in this specific context.
And President Trump's statement itself is quite telling, isn't it? When asked about getting more involved, the source quotes him saying, "Nah, it's possible."
It's possible, yeah. That's a very, very deliberate choice of words, you'd have to assume.
It's not a no.
It's not a no. It's not a we're not even considering it. It's a direct public acknowledgement that, offensive involvement is still on the table. Now, the source speculates maybe this is a negotiating tactic,
Right.
To pressure Iran, which is plausible. That happens in international diplomacy.
Sure.
But whatever the intent behind it, the public statement itself is significant. It really validates the idea that this isn't just some theoretical possibility. It's actually something being considered at the highest levels.
And this whole potential for U.S. action, it's being discussed against the backdrop of what some see as a strategic window, based on Israeli claims about how things stand right now.
Yes, this is a really key part of the strategic argument being made, especially by those pushing for U.S. intervention. Israel has reportedly claimed air superiority over significant chunks of western Iran, including the area around Tehran.
Okay.
The interpretation offered in the source is that this suggests the Iranian air defense network is weaker now than it probably has ever been since Iran's nuclear program really got going.
Why would that be? Sanctions? Lack of modernization? Recent Israeli actions?
Could be a combination of all those things. The source doesn't specify the exact cause, but the claim is the result. The air defense system is currently degraded.
And why is that specific assessment weakened air defenses? Why is that so crucial in the context of potential U.S. involvement?
Because, look, according to the source and the strategic logic being presented,
Mm-hmm.
if Iran's air defenses are significantly weakened, it means it's potentially the lowest risk time for United States bombers to fly overhead and hammer some of those targets.
Ah, right. Back to the bunker busters in Fordo.
Exactly. Remember those deep buried targets Israel reportedly can't hit alone? Sending heavy bombers deep into Iranian airspace to hit those, well, it requires suppressing or somehow navigating their air defenses. If those defenses are genuinely at their weakest point in years, then the risk to those expensive U.S. aircraft, and more importantly, the crews flying them, is hypothetically lower than it would normally be, or maybe ever be again.
So the strategic argument for U.S. offensive action crystallizes. The U.S. has the unique tools needed, the bunker busters, the heavy bombers that Israel lacks. Israel has reportedly, maybe, created a window of opportunity by degrading Iran's air defenses. And this makes the mission to hit those critical underground nuclear sites potentially less hazardous right now than it might be later.
Right.
So for the perspective of those pushing for intervention, this is the moment. Act now while the risk is lower.
Exactly. It creates the sort of convergence of need Israel's capability to U.S. assets and timing this potential strategic window.
And this strategic rationale, it's being championed by some pretty influential voices in the U.S. political scene. The source specifically points to Senator Lindsey Graham.
Yes, Senator Graham is cited as a key figure really pushing this agenda forcefully. He's reportedly advocating from inside of Trump's circle for the U.S. to take decisive action. To go all in is the phrase used if diplomatic efforts fail to completely dismantle Iran's nuclear program.
And the source includes some pretty strong language from him, laying out his case very explicitly.
Oh, he doesn't mince words at all. He states, flat out, that the worst possible outcome is allowing the Iranian nuclear program to survive. Period.
Wow.
He believes that if diplomacy doesn't achieve its complete destruction, then military action isn't just an option, it's a necessity. He's quoted urging President Trump directly, quote, "Give them bombs, fly with them if necessary, to finish the job."
Finish the job.
That phrase, finish the job, is central to his position. He seems to see the current Israeli operation as potentially incomplete unless that nuclear threat is neutralized, and he believes the U.S. is absolutely essential for that part.
And his argument, it goes beyond just the immediate Middle East context, too.
Yeah.
He connects finishing the job with Iran to broader global power dynamics.
He does, yeah, and this really expands the perceived stakes quite considerably. Graham's argument, as the source conveys it, is that decisively dealing with Iran's nuclear program is crucial for showing American resolve and strength on the global stage.
How so?
He argues that successfully confronting Iran is necessary if, quote, you want to get Russia right, you want to make China be better, you want to convince international terrorism we mean business. He frames it as this sort of foundational act, something that sets a precedent and sends a powerful message to other adversaries or challenges around the world. It's a view that sees this specific conflict as deeply interconnected with the major geopolitical challenges facing the U.S. everywhere.
That's a really far-reaching perspective.
Yeah.
It positions the Iran nuclear issue not just as, a regional security problem, but as some kind of linchpin for U.S. foreign policy across multiple continents.
It does. It definitely elevates the importance and the stakes of the decision significantly, tying it into this broader global struggle for influence and stability.
Now, it's important the source is careful to note that this strong push for intervention, it isn't the only voice in the U.S. debate.
Absolutely. Crucial point. It explicitly states that there are very strong, powerful voices arguing against any involvement at all. So this highlights that while there's definitely pressure for intervention, there's also significant counter pressure. There's a real debate happening behind the scenes, likely outlining the immense risks, the potential for uncontrollable escalation, the unforeseen consequences. all the dangers of direct U.S. military action against Iran.
Right.
The source doesn't detail their specific arguments, but the fact they're described as strong and powerful indicates just how contentious this internal discussion must be.
So if we try and synthesize this really complex picture of the U.S. position based only on the source material we have, the U.S. is already involved defensively, putting its people at risk. Israel is making a direct, very specific request for offensive help to hit targets it says it cannot reach. A potential strategic window of reduced risk might be open due to reportedly weakened Iranian air defenses. There's significant political pressure from figures like Senator Graham pushing for a prompt, decisive action, and the president himself has publicly said direct involvement is possible.
That summary really captures the key elements presented in the source, yeah. And based on the sort of confluence of factors, the need, the capability gap, the timing, the political pressure, the public openness to the idea, the source offers a rather striking assessment.
And that assessment is quite stark, isn't it?
It is. The source concludes that it is not unlikely that the United States is engaged in direct military action with Iran within the next week.
Within the next week.
Within the next week. And just to add emphasis to how significant this moment is perceived to be, the source goes even further. It describes this as potentially the most likely time in the last 10, 20, maybe more years for this kind of direct U.S. offensive involvement against Iran to actually happen.
Most likely time in decades.
Wow. That really hammers home the potential significance of this current moment. It suggests that this combination of factors we've just discussed has created a unique and potentially imminent inflection point. It certainly does. According to this assessment, derived from the sources, it elevates this whole thing from a hypothetical discussion to a very tangible near-term possibility. It's a conclusion that just underscores how seriously the situation is being viewed and debated at the highest levels.
Okay, so while the U.S. is grappling with this potential decision, this intense debate, let's turn our attention back to what Israel has actually been doing militarily, on the ground, in the air, since this current phase really kicked off.
Right. So Israel has officially given this operation a name. It's being called Operation Rising Lion.
Okay.
According to statements from Israeli leadership cited in the source, the operation was reportedly already in its third day when this analysis was put together.
And what's been stated as its primary goal? What are they trying to achieve?
The stated goal, as described by Israeli leadership, is an operation that is both historic and unprecedented.
Big words.
Very big words. Its aim is apparently to deliver a significant blow to an existential threat that Iran has built over the years with the goal of annihilating us. So again, you see that framing this is a response to an existential threat. That's absolutely central to how Israel is presenting its actions.
And how effective has the operation been reported to be, at least in its initial phase?
Well, according to the Israeli chief of the general staff, the IDF, is Israel Defense Forces, quote, has paved the way to Tehran and is striking the regime's infrastructure and nuclear program with precision and scale beyond what the enemy had anticipated.
Beyond what they anticipated.
Yeah. The source adds that the information suggests Iran was completely caught off guard by the speed and the scope of the initial strikes. And interestingly, even some figures within the Israeli leadership were reportedly surprised by the apparent initial success and maybe the limited initial response from Iran.
Precision and scale beyond what the enemy had anticipated. That suggests a pretty significant shock to the Iranian system in those opening hours.
It does. And that element of surprise, coupled with the reported precision and scale, it's presented in the source as a really key factor in the apparent early effectiveness of Operation Rising Lion.
And the operation has also demonstrated an expanding reach. Reports of long-range strikes.
Absolutely. The source highlights one specific strike confirmed by the IDF, the bombing of an Iranian refueling plane.
Okay, what's significant about that?
What makes it particularly noteworthy is the location. This strike reportedly happened way up in northeastern Iran, a considerable distance from Israel, something like 2,300 kilometers away, according to the source.
2,300 kilometers. That's a deep strike. What's the significance of hitting a target that far inside Iran?
Well, according to the source, this marks the most distant strike since the beginning of the operation. Its significance really lies in demonstrating Israel's ability to project its power deep into Iranian territory. It's cited as evidence of Israel continuing to expand this air corridor and the air superiority that Israel enjoys over Iran. The implication is that Israel is operating with a pretty high degree of freedom in Iranian airspace, even far from its own borders.
And the source even suggests this might imply non-stealth aircraft are reportedly flying through Iranian airspace.
Which, I mean, if that's true, that would be a very, very bold move.
Yeah.
It indicates a really high level of confidence in Israel's ability to either neutralize or just evade Iranian air defenses, even with aircraft that are typically more vulnerable to being detected. It really reinforces that claim of significant air superiority.
Okay, let's move to what we can actually see, or what analysts can see from above. The source includes analysis of satellite imagery to try and assess the damage at key Iranian air bases targeted in the offensive. This gives us maybe a more objective look at the impact.
Yes, the satellite imagery analysis is crucial here. It provides visual evidence, or at least clues. The source focuses on damage assessments at two specific locations that were reportedly hit early on: the Hamadan Air Base and the Tabriz Air Base.
Okay, let's start with Hamadan. The IDF reportedly claimed it was completely destroyed. How did the satellite imagery analysis square with that claim?
Well, the source is described as being a little nitpicky with the term completely destroyed,
Okay.
suggesting that, yeah, the damage is severe, but maybe it's better characterized as surgical-type destruction. The imagery doesn't show, like, total obliteration of the entire base,
Right.
but rather very precise, very impactful strikes on specific assets within the base.
And what specific damage did the imagery reveal at Hamadan? What could they see?
The analysis highlights penetration of these what appear to be hardened structures with likely then detonations inside.
Hardened structures, like shelters for aircraft.
Exactly. The imagery reportedly shows that the overhead protective cover of these structures, which look like those hardened aircraft shelters, designed to protect planes from attack, they seem to have been penetrated. Like ammunition went right through the reinforced roof or ceiling.
And then detonated inside.
Yeah,
To maximize damage.
that's the interpretation, yeah. The pattern of damage suggests the munitions were designed specifically to punch through that protective layer and then explode internally. That would obviously maximize the destructive effect within the structure, intended to destroy anything housed inside aircraft, sensitive equipment, whatever. The imagery reportedly shows multiple examples of this type of penetration and likely internal detonation across various shelters there.
What about the runways at Hamadan? Were they hit as well?
Yes, the runway was also reportedly hit. It was cratered, making it unusable for a short period of time.
Okay.
The source does note, however, that cratered runways, while they're relatively quickly reparable by a capable military,
Right, fill the holes.
fill the holes, patch it up. So while this would definitely hinder immediate takeoff or landing, it's likely more of a temporary measure. The strategic goal here, according to the source's analysis, was probably just to keep Iran's Air Force grounded during those critical opening hours of the operation.
Yeah, prevent them launching a quick response.
Exactly. Prevent them from launching a rapid aerial counterattack.
Okay, let's look at Tabriz Air Base then. The source mentions imagery from a specific analyst, Brady Afric's view from above Substack. What did that analysis show at Tabriz?
Very similar picture to Hamadan, actually. The imagery at Tabriz also showed significant cratering of the runway, described as pretty impressive stuff.
Wow.
The hits were reportedly directly in the middle of the runway in multiple spots. So again, clearly aimed at disrupting air traffic flow, preventing takeoffs.
And were structures hit there too?
Yeah.
Like the shelters?
Yes. The satellite images also showed hits on buildings in what are described as hardened aircraft hangars near the runway. And again, the imagery reportedly showed that same telltale sign. A single hole right through the top of these structures.
So a consistent pattern. Precision penetration targeting these protective shelters.
Exactly. That consistency is notable, targeting these hardened shelters with munitions specifically designed to penetrate and then detonate inside. Now, the source is careful. It acknowledges that without someone on the ground doing internal battle damage assessment,
Right.
or knowing definitively that every single one of those hangars actually had an aircraft inside,
Sure.
it's hard to say with absolute certainty exactly how many aircraft were destroyed. However, based on the precision and the nature of the strikes on these protective structures, the source concludes it's probably safe to say that at least a fair number of those Iranian aircraft were likely hit hard.
So the overall assessment of the targeting, based on the satellite imagery analysis from the source, is that it was very impressive, very precise. It wasn't just, carpet bombing. It was really focused on specific critical infrastructure, like those hardened aircraft shelters and the runways.
That's the conclusion drawn from the imagery analysis presented in the source, yes. The apparent goal was clearly to significantly degrade Iran's immediate ability to respond from the air and potentially to damage or destroy aircraft housed in those protected structures.
Okay. Beyond the military actions themselves, Israeli leadership is also, understandably, communicating with its own population. And the messaging includes acknowledging the difficult reality, the risks involved here. The source includes details from a statement by the Chief of the General Staff, Lieutenant General Zamir, addressed directly to the people of Israel.
Yes, and this statement is really significant because it's about managing expectations.
Yeah.
It's conveying the seriousness of this moment directly to the public. He reinforces the characterization of the operation as historic and unprecedented, really underlining its importance from their view.
And what's the core message about the home front, about the risks to civilians in Israel?
Well, he emphasizes that defending our home front is a critical component of this campaign. That right there acknowledges the threat posed by Iranian retaliation. But then he delivers the difficult truth. There will be difficult moments. He's essentially preparing the population for potential incoming attacks, for the consequences of being on the receiving end of missile and drone fire.
It makes it clear this is a serious challenge,
Yeah.
maybe different from before.
He states, quote, "We are in the midst of a challenge unlike those we have faced in the past." So yeah, framing this conflict with Iran as being on a different scale, maybe a different nature than previous conflicts. He also explicitly says, we knew there would be a price.
A price.
A price. This implies that the potential cost to the home front, the civilian cost, was anticipated and basically accepted as part of the decision to launch this operation, which he suggests was done, quote, before it became too late to address the threat.
And why is there a price?
Yeah.
Even with Israel's advanced defensive systems like Iron Dome and the others.
Well, he explains that while the IDF is employing its finest systems, methods, and capabilities to minimize casualties, fundamentally there is no such thing as complete protection. And this is just a crucial point about the reality of air defense.
And the source elaborates on that reality too, right? Explains why.
It does. The source discusses the sort of technical limitations of air defense systems,
Mm-hmm.
even the most advanced ones, which the source describes as crazy technology.
Yeah.
Despite incredible advancements in intercepting missiles and drones, these systems are just never 100% accurate. Never. Even if you achieve intercept rates above 90%, which is technically incredible, amazing stuff, that still means that a certain percentage, maybe 5%, maybe 10%, depending on the system and the threat, will inevitably get through if enough munitions are fired.
Right.
As the source puts it pretty bluntly, some of these are going to get through. There's just no two ways about it.
So the message from the general, acknowledging that some incoming fire will get through despite their best efforts, the source deems that accurate and responsible. It's a necessary, if maybe sobering, dose of realism for the public.
It is. It avoids creating false expectations of total safety, prepares people for potential impacts, and reinforces the need for things like vigilance, following safety instructions.
The general also highlights that this isn't just about Iran, right? It's a multi-front war.
Yes, he notes that while the primary focus might be the strikes against the Iranian regime, Israel continues to operate and defend itself in other arenas, like Gaza, potentially other borders, other operational areas.
Right.
And the source adds some context here, mentioning the death of an Israeli soldier in Gaza just the previous day, which serves as a really stark reminder that this conflict isn't limited to just the air campaign against Iran. Other fronts remain active, and they remain costly.
And the message concludes with a call for, well, societal strength, resilience.
It does. The general speaks to the resilience and unity of the people of Israel, the necessity of being ready to make difficult decisions as a, quote, life-seeking nation, and the importance of maintaining modesty, unity, stability, and faith in the justice of our cause. It's a very clear appeal for national cohesion, for steadfastness in the face of this acknowledged danger.
So, while the military is operating offensively, deep inside Iran, potentially, the leadership is simultaneously preparing the civilian population for the potential consequences of that action and appealing for resilience.
That's exactly the duality of the message conveyed in that statement as it's presented in the source. You know, striking hard against the perceived threat while at the same time bracing for the potential blowback.
Okay, let's turn now to what we're observing, or what the sources are observing, from the other side, the Iranian response so far. The source notes an observed trend in Iranian missile launches.
Yes, there has apparently been an observed decrease in the rate of Iranian missile launches day over day since the initial phase of the Israeli operation began. Now, on the surface, that might seem like, a positive sign.
But there's always a but. The source includes a really important cautionary note about interpreting that decrease too quickly.
Absolutely. This is crucial. The source explicitly warns against jumping to the conclusion that this automatically means Iran is running low on munitions.
Right.
It draws a really useful analogy here to the early stages of the conflict in Ukraine. Remember how similar assumptions were made about Russia's munition stocks based on observed launch rates?
Yeah, and those turned out to be wrong.
Exactly. Those assumptions proved premature. The point is, military operations often involve changes in pacing, changes in tactics. It doesn't necessarily mean immediate depletion of resources.
And why is that caution particularly relevant when we're talking about Iran?
Because, according to the source, intelligence assessments strongly suggest Iran is believed to still possess quite a few underground facilities with missiles, drones, and long-range munitions that we believe Iran has yet to tap into.
Ah, hidden reserve.
Hidden reserves, likely including some of their larger missile systems, the more potent stuff, maybe?
So a temporary reduction in launches could be purely tactical then. Maybe they're conserving specific types of munitions, maybe they're planning a different phase of response, or maybe they're just dealing with the immediate damage to their launchers or command and control from the Israeli strikes.
Exactly. Any or all of those are plausible. It doesn't automatically mean they're running out of everything.
Right.
That's the caution advised by the source. They likely have significant hidden reserves, hidden capabilities that just haven't been brought into play yet. So we shouldn't mistake a shift in operational tempo for a fundamental lack of resources. Not yet, anyway.
What about the drone threat specifically?
Yeah.
How has Israel fared against Iranian drones, according to the source?
Well, according to the source, Israel has been very, very effective in eliminating the drone threat so far. They seem to be having a really high degree of success in detecting and neutralizing these systems before they can actually cause damage.
And the source provides some interesting details on how these drones are being intercepted. It's not just missiles.
Right. Israel has confirmed shooting down more Iranian drones, and notably, the report states that, quote, 0 drones have actually penetrated Israeli airspace to date.
0. That's impressive.
That's a very significant claim about their defensive success against this specific type of threat. And apparently, footage of these interceptions is becoming more publicly available because drones are, slower, often larger than missiles. These interceptions are perhaps easier for the public to actually visualize.
Yeah.
And the source mentions one specific, maybe somewhat surprising method being employed. Helicopters firing their guns, 30-millimeter guns at these drones.
Helicopters shooting down drones with cannons. That sounds almost World War II-ish compared to billion-dollar missile defense systems.
It does, doesn't it? A bit low-tech on the surface. But the source describes it as a very inexpensive way to down these relatively slow-moving drones.
Ah, cost-effective.
Very cost-effective. It's practical. And it's being used alongside the more sophisticated air defenses, presumably for different types of threats or in different situations. The fact that it's being highlighted, combined with that claim of 0 penetrations by drones, well, it suggests it's proving to be a pretty effective part of their layered defense strategy against this particular threat vector.
So they're employing this mix of high-tech missile interceptors and seemingly lower-tech but effective gunships.
Mm-hmm.
And the reported success against drones, specifically so far, is very high.
That's the picture painted by the source material regarding the drone threat and Israel's response to it, yes.
Okay, so, wow. We've delved into the potential for direct U.S. offensive involvement, driven by Israel's stated need in this perceived strategic window. Along with the intense political debate happening in the U.S., we've examined Israel's operational goals, Operation Rising Lion, and its reported initial success, including the specific damage revealed by satellite imagery at key Iranian bases.
Mm-hmm.
We've heard about the challenging reality of risk being conveyed to the Israeli home front and the technical reasons why complete protection, unfortunately, isn't possible. And we've looked at the initial Iranian response, noting that crucial caution about interpreting observed trends like missile launches. Where does all this leave us as we look ahead? What's the assessment?
Well, the source's overall assessment is pretty stark. This situation is nowhere near over. Both Israel and Iran are reportedly kind of digging in for what could be a long fight. So this isn't being framed as some brief exchange of blows that's now concluded. It's seen as potentially a much more protracted conflict.
And that prospect, the idea of a longer fight, that connects directly back to the U.S. element we started with, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The decision regarding potential direct U.S. offensive involvement remains completely tied to those fundamental strategic goals Israel is pursuing specifically, hitting those deep underground nuclear targets they say they can't handle alone.
Right.
And the argument for striking now is still linked to that potential lowest risk window offered by those reportedly weakened Iranian air defenses.
And the advocates for action, people like Senator Graham, they're likely emphasizing that if this is indeed going to be a long fight, then hitting those critical targets early, while the window might be open, could significantly alter the whole trajectory or maybe the eventual outcome of the conflict, at least from their perspective.
Precisely. The strategic calculation from that viewpoint is that delaying action might mean facing higher risks later on, especially if Iran manages to repair or somehow enhance its defenses over time.
If we step back for a second and consider the broader implications of all this, what does the precision of the Israeli strikes, the stuff we see in the satellite imagery, what does that tell us about modern military capabilities today?
Well, it reveals the incredibly advanced state of modern precision targeting and munitions, doesn't it? At least for highly capable military powers like Israel, the ability to, penetrate hardened shelters and cause internal detonations, as described in the satellite analysis, that demonstrates a level of capability that significantly changes the calculus for any state trying to protect critical assets. Building deep, hardened sites is only truly effective if they really are impenetrable, and this imagery suggests that's becoming increasingly difficult to guarantee against the most advanced air forces.
And the intense U.S. debate about intervention, what does that reveal about, the complexities of alliances and foreign policy in the current global climate?
Oh, it underscores the immense burden, the difficult choices involved in being a global superpower and a key ally in really volatile regions. It highlights the tough trade-offs. Balancing support for allies against the potential risk to your own personnel, the huge economic cost, and always the potential for wider regional or even global escalation. And the fact that figures like Senator Graham are framing this in terms of Russia, China, global terrorism, it shows just how interconnected these regional conflicts are perceived to be with the broader geopolitical competition. It's not just about the Middle East anymore. It's framed as being about global order, about deterrence from that perspective.
And that multi-front war reality that the Israeli leadership mentioned.
That's such a crucial reminder that none of this is happening in a vacuum. Decisions and actions taken in the conflict with Iran are deeply intertwined with and potentially impact other ongoing conflicts and tensions, whether that's in Gaza or on the border with Lebanon or elsewhere entirely. It just adds layers and layers of complexity and potential trigger points for wider escalation.
So bringing this all back to you, the listener, why does understanding the nuances of this deep dive, all these details, why does it actually matter?
Because events like these, involving major powers, strategic military assets, fundamental questions of national survival, regional dominance, they have ripple effects far, far beyond the immediate conflict zone.
Right.
They influence international relations. They can impact global energy prices, global markets. They directly relate to global security and stability. And they fuel really intense domestic political debates in countries all around the world, definitely including the United States. By understanding the specific details, like why bunker busters are the specific need, or the inherent limitations of even the most advanced air defense, or the strategic logic behind this potential window of opportunity, you're just better equipped to cut through the simplified headlines, the easy narratives.
Yeah.
You can start to understand the real calculations, the real risks, the immense pressures involved. And that just makes you a much more informed observer in what is, let's face it, a very complex world.
It's about having the context, right, to understand what's really happening beneath the surface and what the potential stakes actually are.
Precisely. It gives you a framework, a lens for evaluating new information as it comes out and for asking more informed questions about future developments.
Okay, so as we wrap things up on this deep dive into the escalating situation between Israel and Iran and this really significant question of potential direct U.S. military involvement, we've explored Israel's operational goals, Operation Rising Lion, the reported initial precision strikes on key Iranian bases, the challenging reality of risk being communicated to the Israeli home front despite their advanced defenses, the initial observations of the Iranian response with that important caution about interpreting trends, and of course the high-stakes debate happening within the U.S. government about potential direct military action, driven by that strategic need for capabilities Israel apparently lacks and this perceived window of opportunity.
It's definitely a situation with profound implications, and the information available from these combined sources provides some really critical insights, I think, into the strategic thinking and the assessments driving the actions and the considerations on multiple sides.
And on that note, here's maybe a final thought for you to consider as you reflect on this deep dive. Given the reported precision of the Israeli strikes we've discussed, and the stated ultimate goal of eliminating the Iranian nuclear threat, a goal that, according to these reports, requires specific U.S. capabilities. Does the ultimate success or failure of this entire complex, dangerous operation hinge more on military capability? Who has what weapons, what aircraft, what defenses? Or does it hinge more on political will, the willingness of leaders, particularly perhaps in the United States, to make that incredibly difficult decision to commit forces, to accept the inherent risks, and potentially escalate the conflict significantly to achieve that specific strategic objective?
Yeah, that's a fundamental question, isn't it? About power and intent and the limits of military action in achieving political goals. A lot to think about there.
Keep exploring. Keep those questions coming. Until next time, keep digging.